The dense woodlands of New Hampshire possess a quiet gravity, particularly in late autumn when the canopy thins and the forest floor becomes a carpet of damp, decaying leaves. In the town of Allenstown, Bear Brook State Park spans 10,000 acres of this terrain, a vast expanse of pine and oak that offers solitude to hikers and hunters alike. It is a place where nature usually reclaims whatever is left behind, swallowing old stone walls and forgotten trails. However, in 1985, the woods revealed something that refused to be forgotten, initiating a mystery that would haunt the region for decades. The sequence of events began on November 10th, 1985. The air was crisp, signaling the approach of a New England winter. A local resident was moving through the trees on the outskirts of the park, navigating an area known for the charred ruins of a building that had once served as a camp store. This specific patch of land, privately owned but adjacent to the state park, was secluded, accessible only by an old logging road that saw infrequent traffic. As the hunter moved through the undergrowth, his attention was drawn to a large, industrial object that seemed distinctly out of place against the backdrop of gray trunks and brown earth. It was a 55-gallon metal drum, the kind typically used for chemical storage or industrial transport. It lay on its side, partially obscured by brush and leaves, suggesting it had been there for some time. Yet, it had not fully rusted away. Illegal dumping is unfortunately common in rural areas, and the sight of a discarded barrel might have been dismissed as mere environmental negligence. However, curiosity, or perhaps a sense of civic duty, compelled the man to investigate closer. The container was open. Inside, wrapped in heavy plastic sheeting, was a mass that did not resemble ordinary refuse. Upon closer inspection, the realization of what was concealed within the plastic triggered an immediate and visceral reaction. It was not trash, and it was not animal. The hunter retreated from the woods and contacted the Allenstown Police Department. When law enforcement officers arrived at the scene, the atmosphere shifted from a quiet autumn afternoon to the sterile, urgent tension of a formal investigation. They approached the drum with caution, securing the perimeter around the site. The location was heavily wooded and difficult to access, which immediately raised questions about how such a heavy object had been transported there. It would have required a vehicle and significant effort to move the drum from the nearest road to its resting place among the trees. The contents of the barrel were carefully examined. Inside, authorities found 2 individuals. The first was an adult female, likely between the ages of 23 and 33. The second was a female child, estimated to be between 5 and 11 years old. They had been placed inside the drum and concealed with plastic, intended to remain hidden indefinitely. The condition of the individuals indicated that a significant amount of time had passed since the loss of life occurred, perhaps several years. This passage of time had erased the features that would allow for immediate visual identification. There was no clothing that could be easily traced, no wallets, no identification cards. They were simply there, silent and nameless, in the middle of the woods. The investigation that followed was exhaustive, but deeply frustrating. The state police and local authorities scoured the area for clues. They searched for missing persons reports that matched the description of a mother and daughter who had vanished in the late 1970s or early 1980s. They expected someone to come forward, a family member looking for a lost sister, a neighbor wondering about a woman and child who had suddenly moved away. Yet the phone lines remained silent. No one claimed them. No one seemed to know they were gone. The lack of a match in the missing persons databases was baffling. It was as if these two people had existed in a vacuum, disconnected from society even before their lives ended. The cause of their passing was determined to be unnatural, the result of severe physical trauma. It was clear that this was not an accident, but a deliberate act followed by a calculated concealment. The heavy industrial drum suggested a perpetrator with access to such materials, perhaps someone who worked in construction or a mill, but without identities for the individuals. Connecting them to a suspect was nearly impossible. The case, known locally as the Allenstown mystery, went cold. The two unknown individuals were laid to rest in a single casket, their headstone marking them only as a woman and child found in the woods. 15 years passed. The seasons cycled over Bear Brook State Park, burying the site of the discovery under layer after layer of leaves and snow. The year 2000 arrived, bringing with it new technologies and a fresh perspective on cold cases. The mystery of the lady and the child in the barrel had never truly left the minds of the investigators who had worked the scene. It remained an open wound in the community's history. In May of 2000, the investigation saw a sudden resurgence. A state trooper, reviewing the case file, found himself drawn back to the question of the barrel. Theories regarding the case had evolved, and there was a renewed interest in understanding the geography of the site. The inquiry led investigators back to the exact location where the first drum had been found. The area was near the site of the burned-down Bear Brook store, a detail that felt increasingly significant. On May 9th, 2000, law enforcement officials returned to the woods. They were not expecting to find anything new. The search was intended to be a review of the terrain, a way to visualize the crime scene with fresh eyes. Sergeant John Cody of the New Hampshire State Police was walking the perimeter, looking at the ground that had been searched 15 years prior. Approximately 300 feet from where the first barrel had been discovered, something caught the sergeant's eye. It was another industrial container, remarkably similar to the first. This one was also a 55-gallon drum, resting in the woods, seemingly invisible to the passers-by of the last decade and a half. It sat slightly further back, blended into the landscape by the vegetation that had grown up around it. The discovery sent a shockwave through the investigation team. For 15 years, they had believed they were looking for the identity of two people. They had constructed theories based on a mother and child. Now, as they examined the contents of the second barrel, the scope of the tragedy doubled. Inside the second container were two more individuals. Both were young female children. One was estimated to be between 2 and 4 years old. The other significantly younger, perhaps between 1 and 3 years old. Like the first group, they had been concealed and left to the elements. The realization was staggering. For 15 years, while police searched for answers regarding the first barrel, 2 more children had been lying in the darkness, just a football field away. The proximity of the 2 barrels suggested they were placed there around the same time. The methods of concealment were identical. The type of containers used matched. It became undeniably clear that this was a single event involving 4 individuals. The investigation was no longer about a woman and a child. It was about an entire group, likely a family, erased from existence. The finding of the second barrel deepened the mystery rather than solving it. If 4 people, a woman, and 3 young children had vanished simultaneously, the lack of missing persons reports became even more inexplicable. How does a woman and 3 children disappear without a school, a neighbor, or a relative raising an alarm? The silence surrounding their lives was as absolute as the silence of the woods where they were found. Forensic analysis of the second group mirrored the first. The passage of time made identification difficult. The cause of the loss of life was consistent with the first discovery, indicating trauma. The timeline was adjusted. It was believed that the incident took place sometime between 1977 and 1985, a window of nearly 8 years. The psychological impact on the community and the investigators was profound. The site in Allenstown was no longer just a crime scene. It was a graveyard for the anonymous. The failure to find the second barrel in 1985 weighed heavily on those involved. Though the density of the woods and the chaotic nature of the terrain provided some explanation, the barrels had been rolled or carried into a thicket that was not easily penetrated by casual observation. With 4 individuals now recovered, the the profile of the case shifted. Investigators began looking for a family unit. They scrutinized the history of the adjacent trailer park, a transient community where people often moved in and out without establishing deep roots. They looked at the employees of the mill that had once stood nearby. They questioned hunters and loggers, yet the essential question remained unanswered. Who were they? The disparity between the violence of the act and the anonymity of the individuals created a haunting paradox. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide them, yet no one seemed to be looking for them. The industrial nature of the disposal, the cold, chemical drums, contrasted sharply with the innocence of the children found within. The Allenstown Four, as they came to be known, became a symbol of the forgotten. This phase of the investigation, marked by the two discoveries 15 years apart, set the stage for a forensic puzzle that would require science that did not yet exist to solve. The incident itself, the finding of the barrels, was merely the opening chapter of a much longer, darker narrative. It established the physical reality of the crime, but it provided almost no context. There was only the woods, the barrels, and the four silent figures who waited for a name. The trees of Bear Brook State Park held their secret close, yielding it only in pieces, demanding that the world look closer at the shadows between the pines. The initial discovery in 1985 had been a shock. The second, in 2000, was a revelation of the true scale of the horror that had taken place in the quiet corner of New Hampshire. The forest has a way of keeping secrets, holding on to them with the grasp of roots deep in the soil. In Allenstown, New Hampshire, within the dense perimeter of Bear Brook State Park, the secrets were kept inside industrial drums. The story of the Bear Brook case is not just about the individuals found there, but about the staggering anomalies that surrounded their discovery, the silence that followed, and the scientific paradoxes that baffled investigators for decades. This was not a typical investigation where a name is missing and a search is launched. This was a puzzle where the pieces were blank, and the picture they formed seemed to defy logic. The first anomaly was the timeline of discovery itself. It began on a November day in 1985. A hunter moving through the woods stumbled upon a 55-gallon metal drum. It had been discarded in a way that suggested it was meant to be forgotten, blended into the detritus of the forest floor. When authorities arrived and the contents were examined, they found an adult female and a female child. The tragedy was evident, yet the immediate investigation yielded nothing. There were no missing persons reports that matched the description. No frantic family members were calling the local precinct. The two individuals were simply there, existing in a vacuum of identity. They became known only by the location of their discovery, untethered to a name or a history. For 15 years, the investigation remained static. The file grew dusty, a cold case that haunted those who had touched it but offered no new avenues. Then came the second anomaly, a discovery that shifted the case from a local mystery to a confusing labyrinth. In the year 2000, a state police sergeant returned to the site. The inquiry had never truly closed for him. In the process of reviewing the location, he found a second barrel, roughly 100 yards from where the first had been located back in 1985. This second container held 2 more individuals, both female children. The realization sent a shockwave through the law enforcement community. The second barrel had been there the entire time, resting in the same patch of woods, weathering the same winters. For a decade and a half, investigators had believed they were looking for a woman and a child, unaware that the scope of the incident was double what they imagined. The proximity of the barrels suggested they were placed at the same time. Yet, the 15-year gap in their discovery highlighted how easily the forest could obscure the truth. As forensic science advanced, the case moved from the field to the laboratory, where the anomalies became even more profound. DNA analysis was conducted to establish the relationships between the 4 individuals. The assumption was straightforward. Investigators believed they were looking at a family unit, perhaps a mother and 3 daughters. The results, however, fractured that assumption. The genetic testing revealed a complex web of kinship that deepened the mystery. The adult female was confirmed to be the mother of the oldest child found in 1985 and the youngest child found in 2000. However, the middle child, also found in the second barrel, was not biologically related to the woman or the other 2 children. This revelation was jarring. It meant that in this isolated patch of New Hampshire woods, there was a family unit that included an unrelated child. Who was she? How did she come to be with this family? This non-biological connection suggested a complex social dynamic that did not fit the standard profile of a family disappearance. It hinted at a chaotic domestic situation or an unconventional guardianship that had gone terribly wrong. The next anomaly arose from the science of geography. For years, the working theory was that these individuals were likely local to New Hampshire, or perhaps the broader New England area. It seemed logical that whoever was responsible for their placement in the park was familiar with the terrain. However, the lack of local identification was puzzling. If they were locals, someone would have noticed a woman and 3 children vanishing from the community. A classroom would have an empty desk. A neighbor would notice a quiet house. The silence was deafening. Isotope analysis provided the answer, and in doing so, created a new set of questions. by analyzing the chemical signatures locked in the enamel of the teeth and the strands of hair, scientists could reconstruct the travel history of the individuals. The isotopes act as a biological passport, recording the water consumed and the food eaten in specific geological regions. The results shattered the local theory. The analysis indicated that these individuals were not native to New Hampshire. In fact, they had spent very little time in the region before their lives ended. The chemical markers suggested a life of movement. They had spent time in the more arid regions of the United States, specifically the Southwest or the West Coast. The data pointed to California, Arizona, or possibly Texas. They were travelers, moving across the continent in visible transients, who arrived in the Northeast only to disappear shortly after. This explained the lack of local missing persons reports, but opened a chasm of logistical questions. How did a woman and 3 children travel thousands of miles without leaving a paper trail? This transient lifestyle contributed to the phenomenon of the unmissed. This is perhaps the most unsettling anomaly of the Bear Brook case. In a modern society connected by databases, telephones, and social networks, it seems impossible for 4 people to vanish without triggering an alarm. Yet that is exactly what happened. The isolation of the individuals suggests they were kept apart from the systems that usually track our lives. They likely did not attend school regularly, or if they did, they moved so frequently that their absence was attributed to a transfer rather than a disappearance. The woman likely did not have stable employment or close ties to extended family who would pursue an investigation. They existed in the margins, led by someone who knew how to keep them hidden even while they were in plain sight. The mystery of the unrelated child drew particular attention to the male figure connected to the case. DNA testing eventually linked the unrelated middle child to a man who went by many names, primarily known in the context of this investigation as Bob Evans. This connection was a pivotal moment. It bridged the gap between the individuals in the barrels and a living suspect, even though that suspect had since passed away in prison. The anomaly here was the nature of the suspect himself. He was a chameleon, a man who shed identities like old coats. He moved across the country, leaving a trail of fabricated names and broken lives. The fact that he had a biological daughter in the barrel, the middle child, who was not related to the woman or the other children, painted a disturbing picture of his movements. It implied he had collected people, merging different lives into a fabricated family unit that traveled with him. He was the common denominator, the force that brought these disparate genetic lines together in a tragic finality. The complexity of the case required a type of science that did not exist when the barrels were first found. genetic genealogy, the technique of using DNA databases to find distant relatives and reverse engineer a family tree, was the key to unlocking the final anomaly. For decades, the individuals were known only as Jane Doe, a generic placeholder for a lost life. The effort to restore their names required tracing fourth and fifth cousins, building trees that spanned centuries, and narrowing down the branches until they pointed to specific missing women from the West Coast. It was this backward engineering that finally illuminated the sheer distance of the tragedy. The individuals had family who loved them, but those families were looking in the wrong places, separated by time, geography, and the deceptive narratives of the man who had taken them away. The families were searching in California, while the answers lay in a plastic drum in New Hampshire. The Bear Brook case stands as a testament to the fact that identity is fragile. It can be stripped away by distance and time. The anomalies, the split discovery, the unrelated child, the cross-country isotope trail demonstrate how easily the truth can be fragmented. It was not just a matter of finding the individuals. It was a matter of piecing together a broken reality. The forest held the physical evidence, but the story was scattered across the map, hidden in the microscopic chemical structures of hair and the complex double helix of DNA. When one looks at the entirety of the investigation, the most profound realization is the silence. For nearly 30 years, these four individuals waited to be known. They defied the standard procedures of law enforcement. They did not fit the boxes on the forms. They were a unique collection of circumstances that required the world of forensic science to catch up to them. The resolution of their identities was not just a closing of a file. It was the correction of a decades-long error in the record of existence, proving that even the most complex anomalies can eventually be deciphered. The dense woodlands of Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire, possess a quiet beauty that often masks the secrets kept beneath the canopy. For decades, the towering pines and rolling terrain served as a recreational haven, a place for hikers and nature enthusiasts to escape the noise of the modern world. However, for those involved in one of the most baffling criminal investigations in New England history, the park became synonymous with a silence that was heavy, oppressive, and seemingly unbreakable. This is the story of the dead ends, the years where the trail went cold, and the agonizing realization that four individuals could vanish from the face of the earth without a single person appearing to look for them. The mystery began on a chilly November day in 1985. A hunter, walking through a section of the park that had once been the site of a burned-down general store, stumbled upon a 55-gallon industrial drum. It was not uncommon to find refuse in the woods, discarded by careless locals or construction crews looking to avoid disposal fees. However, the contents of this particular drum were not construction debris. Inside, wrapped in plastic, were two individuals. One was an adult female, likely in her mid-20s. The other was a female child, estimated to be between 8 and 10 years old. The discovery sent a shockwave through the local authorities. Yet, the initial investigation faced an immediate and insurmountable wall. There were no wallets, no identification cards, and no clothing tags that could offer a specific point of origin. The condition of the individuals suggested they had been placed there years prior, perhaps as early as the late 70s or very early 80s. The elements and the passage of time had eroded many traditional forensic clues, leaving investigators with little more than the biological profiles of two unknown females. Standard procedure dictated a review of missing persons reports. Law enforcement personnel scoured local filings, then expanded their search to the state level, and eventually the national databases. The logic was sound. A young mother and her daughter do not simply disappear without family members, friends, or school officials raising an alarm. Detectives waited for the phone to ring. They waited for a distraught grandmother, a searching father, or a concerned neighbor to step forward and say they had been looking for these two people for years. The phone never rang. The reports yielded no matches. Every potential lead that seemed promising, a runaway from Boston, a missing woman from Maine, eventually fizzled out upon closer inspection. The dental records did not match. The heights were inconsistent. The timelines did not align. The case, classified as a suspicious death investigation, began to drift into the cold case files, known only as the Allenstown mystery. The two individuals were buried in a local cemetery under a headstone that read simply, "Here lies a mortal remains known only to God." 15 years passed. The world moved on. The technology of law enforcement evolved, bringing digital databases and advanced communication. But the file on the woman and child in the barrel gathered dust. Then, in the year 2000, the silence of Bear Brook was broken again, not by a new tip, but by a hunch. A state trooper who had been intrigued by the 1985 discovery returned to the site. The geography of the woods had not changed, but the perspective had. He wondered if something had been missed. It was a tedious task, combing through the underbrush and the soil near the location of the first drum, approximately 100 yards away from the original site. The trooper found a second 55-gallon drum. The similarities were chilling. Like the first, this drum contained two individuals. Both were young female children. One was estimated to be between 2 and 4 years old, and the other was even younger, likely between 1 and 3. The implications of this second discovery were staggering. The timeline suggested that all 4 individuals had been placed there around the same time, likely between 1977 and 1985. The investigation was no longer about a mother and child. It was potentially about an entire family unit or a group of associated individuals who had been removed from society in one fell swoop. The discovery of the second barrel reignited the investigation with a fervor that had not been seen in over a decade. Surely, investigators thought, the disappearance of a woman and 3 children would have left a mark. 4 people leave a massive footprint. They have doctors, dentists, landlords, neighbors, and extended family. The sheer volume of missing people should have triggered a match in the national systems. Yet the silence returned, deeper and more frustrating than before. Science became the primary hope for breaking the deadlock. In the years following the second discovery, advanced DNA testing became available. The results provided a picture of the group that was both illuminating and confusing. The adult woman was confirmed to be the mother of the eldest child found in 1985, and the youngest child found in 2000. However, the middle child, the one aged 2 to 4 found in the second barrel, was not maternally related to the woman or the other 2 girls. This revelation shattered the simple narrative of a single mother and her 3 daughters. Who was the third child? Was she a cousin, a stepchild, a neighbor's child who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time? The genetic disconnection added a layer of complexity that made searching for their identities exponentially harder. If they were not a biological family unit, the search parameters had to be widened to include blended families or informal living arrangements. Investigators turned to isotopic analysis, a scientific method that examines the chemical signatures in hair, teeth, and bone to determine where a person lived and what water they drank. The results painted a portrait of a transient existence. The isotopes suggested the woman and children had moved frequently across the United States. They had spent time in the Northeast, but also potentially in the West or Southwest. This was not a family with deep roots in a single town where everyone knew their names. They were ghosts long before they were found, drifting through communities without anchoring themselves long enough to be missed. Facial reconstruction artists were brought in to give the silent figures a face. Using the physical structures of the skulls, they created 3-dimensional busts and 2-dimensional sketches. These images were broadcast on television, printed in newspapers, and circulated on the emerging internet. The faces were haunting, generic enough to look like anyone's neighbor, yet specific enough to hopefully spark a memory. The public response was significant, but it led only to more dead ends. Hundreds of tips flooded in. People saw resemblances to a cousin who moved away in the 70s, or a woman they saw at a grocery store once. Detectives chased every single lead. They traveled across state lines, interviewed aging witnesses, and dug through dusty archives of long-closed schools. One particularly promising lead involved a woman who had vanished from a nearby state around the correct time. She had children of similar ages. The physical descriptions seemed to align. For a brief moment, the investigators allowed themselves to hope that they could finally put names to the individuals in the barrels. But when the dental records were compared, the hope evaporated. It was not a match. The missing woman from the neighboring state was still missing, and the Bear Brook 4 remained nameless. The psychological toll on the investigators was profound. They were fighting against the erasure of existence. It seemed impossible that in a modern society, 4 human beings could be subjected to a fatal incident and discarded without a single person demanding answers. The lack of a missing persons report suggested a tragic isolation. It implied that the person responsible for their deaths was also the only person who knew they were gone. Or perhaps more disturbingly, the people who should have been looking for them had been told a lie, that the family had moved away, started a new life, and did not want to be found. As the years ticked by, the case of the Bear Brook 4 became a cautionary tale about the limitations of traditional police work. Fingerprints were useless without a record to match them against. DNA was useless without a comparison sample. The faces in the sketches stared out from the cold case flyers, pleading for recognition. But the generation that might have known them was aging and passing away. The woods of Allenstown held their secret tight. The barrels were gone, removed to evidence lockers, but the mystery remained. The investigation had exhausted every avenue. They had checked the schools, the hospitals, the welfare rolls. They had analyzed the soil, the insects, the pollen. They had done everything humanly possible. And yet, the individuals remained Jane Doe, and 3 distinct John or Jane Does. It was a dead end in the truest sense of the phrase. The road had run out. There was no evidence left to process, no new witnesses coming forward. The case sat in a state of suspended animation, waiting for a key that did not yet exist. The investigators knew that the answer lay in the biology of the individuals themselves, but the science required to unlock it was still the stuff of science fiction. Until that day came, the woman and the 3 little girls would remain defined only by the location where they were found, silent witnesses to a crime that time was threatening to wash away completely. The stillness of the forest had reclaimed the site, but the question hung in the air, unanswered and haunting. Who were they? The woods of New Hampshire have a way of keeping secrets holding them close beneath a canopy of pine and oak that stretches for miles. In Allenstown, within the boundaries of Bear Brook State Park, that silence was profound. It was a quiet that lasted for decades, masking a tragedy that would eventually reshape the way investigators approached the concept of identity itself. The case that emerged from these woods was not merely a procedural puzzle, but a haunting narrative of anonymity, a story about individuals who had vanished so completely that the world seemed to have forgotten they ever existed. This chapter of the investigation, which we might call the lingering signal, refers to the faint, persistent echoes of life that refused to fade away, even when the names and faces were lost to time. It began on a crisp day in November of 1985. A hunter moving through the dense underbrush of the park stumbled upon something unnatural. It was a 55-gallon metal drum, overturned and resting in a way that suggested it had been discarded with haste. The container was not empty. Inside, investigators discovered the first set of clues that would spark a decades-long search for answers. 2 individuals were found within the drum. One was an adult female, and the other was a young female child. They had no identification, no clothing that could be easily traced to a specific retailer, and no personal effects that offered a name. They were simply there, suspended in time, concealed within the industrial drum. For 15 years, this discovery remained an isolated anomaly. The local authorities exhausted every lead. They scoured missing persons reports, contacted agencies in neighboring states, and published composites of what the individuals might have looked like in life. Yet the phone lines remained silent. No one called to claim a missing sister, a lost daughter, or a vanished friend. It was as if they had dropped out of the sky. The lack of connection to the community suggested they were transient, perhaps passing through the region. But the permanence of their concealment implied a local connection to the site. The case went cold, the files gathering dust as the years turned into a new millennium. Then came the year 2000. The investigation was revisited, not because of a new tip, but because of a diligent curiosity. A state trooper returned to the site in Bear Brook State Park, revisiting the location where the first drum had been found. The terrain had not changed much, but the perspective had. Looking at the area with fresh eyes, the trooper ventured slightly further into the brush, perhaps 100 yards from the original location. There, hidden by 15 years of foliage and neglect, lay a second 55-gallon drum. The contents of this second container deepened the mystery exponentially. 2 more young female children were discovered. The realization sent a shockwave through the investigative team. This was not an isolated incident involving 2 people. This was a group of 4. The timeline suggested that all four had been placed there around the same time, likely between 1980 and 1984, meaning the second container had sat undiscovered, weathering the New Hampshire winters, while police walked the grid just a football field away. The proximity of the two discoveries confirmed a grim pattern. These four individuals were connected, likely a family unit, and they had been erased from society together. The silence surrounding them was the most disturbing aspect. How could a woman and 3 children vanish without triggering a frantic search? Where were the school records, the neighbors, the extended family members wondering why holiday cards had stopped coming? This absence of inquiry suggested a life lived on the margins, or perhaps a perpetrator who was skilled at severing ties. The investigators were left with physical evidence, but no context. They had the what and the where, but the who and the why remained agonizingly out of reach. Science became the only voice these individuals had. In the absence of names, forensic anthropology and later isotope analysis began to tell a story that police work alone could not. Examination of the dental formations and skeletal structures revealed that the adult female and the oldest and youngest child were biologically related. They were mother and daughters. However, the middle child, the third individual to be identified in the sequence, was not biologically related to the others. This added a complex layer to the dynamic. They were a blended group, living together, traveling together, and ultimately ending up in the woods of Allenstown together. The concept of a lingering signal became literal. When scientists analyzed the chemical signatures locked inside their teeth and hair. Isotopes are variants of chemical elements that vary depending on geography. The water you drink and the food you eat leaves a specific atomic fingerprint in your tissues, recording a map of where you have lived. The data retrieved from these individuals painted a picture of constant movement. They had not spent their entire lives in New Hampshire. The signatures pointed to time spent in the west and southwest regions of the United States. They had moved across the country, crossing state lines, perhaps living a nomadic existence. This explained the lack of local missing persons reports. They were not from Allenstown. They were from everywhere and nowhere. As the years pressed on, the investigation intersected with the timeline of a man known by many names. He was a figure who moved like a phantom through the systems of law enforcement, using aliases to mask a trail of criminal activity. In the early 2010s, a connection was drawn between the Bear Brook case and a man who went by the name Robert or Bob Evans. He had lived in New Hampshire during the critical window of time. He had worked as an electrician at the Wambeck Mill in Manchester, a location where similar industrial drums were used. He was a man who existed in the blind spots of society, a chameleon who shed identities as easily as he shed responsibilities. The link between Evans and the Bear Brook site was solidified through genetic testing, but not in the way investigators initially expected. While Evans was not the father of the 3 related females, he was confirmed to be the biological father of the middle child, the one who was not related to the others. This revelation was pivotal. It placed Evans at the center of this web. He was the common denominator. He had custody of his biological daughter and was associated with the woman and her 2 children. The picture was becoming clearer, but the names were still missing. Evans, who had died in prison in 2010, took the true identities of these individuals to the grave. He never spoke of them. He never confessed. He simply let the silence continue. The investigators were left to reconstruct the lives of the deceased through the faint signals left behind. They knew now that the woman and her children likely met Evans in another state, perhaps California or Texas, and traveled with him to New Hampshire. The isolation techniques used by individuals like Evans often involve cutting off the partner from family and friends, creating a closed loop where no one on the outside realizes anything is wrong until it is far too late. The lack of a missing persons report was not an accident. It was a byproduct of a carefully constructed reality where the individuals were made to be invisible before the fatal incident ever occurred. For a long time, the individuals were known only by the year they were found and the location. They were the Allenstown 4. The community adopted them in spirit, holding vigils and maintaining their resting place. But the dignity of a name was the one thing they could not provide. The investigation turned into a waiting game, waiting for technology to catch up with the ambition of the detectives. They needed a way to search, not just for a direct match, but for distant relatives, for second and third cousins who might hold a piece of the genetic puzzle. This brought the case to the threshold of a new era in forensics: genetic genealogy. This was the process of using commercial DNA databases to build family trees backward in time. It was a tedious, complex method that required tracing lineage through census records, obituaries, and birth certificates, looking for the point where a family tree had a broken branch. The signal was no longer just chemical isotopes. It was digital. It was data stored in servers, waiting for a genealogist to connect the dots. The lingering signal of the Bear Brook case is a testament to the persistence of truth. It suggests that no matter how deep the woods or how long the passage of time, identity cannot be completely erased. There is always a trace, a tooth, a strand of hair, a distant cousin submitting a sample to a website on a whim. The story of these 4 individuals is a dark chapter in the history of New Hampshire. But it is also a story of resilience on the part of those who refused to let them remain nameless. The silence that began in 1985 was eventually broken, not by a confession, but by the relentless application of science and the refusal of investigators to accept the anonymity of the individuals involved. The woods of Bear Brook held the secret for decades, but they could not hold it forever. The barrels, the industrial waste, the concealment, all of it was an attempt to silence the lives that had been lost. But the signal endured, faint and static-filled, waiting for the right technology and the right human determination to tune in and finally hear what history was trying to say. This period of the unknown, this long stretch of years where they were simply the unidentified, serves as a bridge between the old world of police work and the new age of genomic resolution. It reminds us that even when a name is stolen, the truth of a person's existence remains, waiting to be reclaimed.